the architect essentially of standards that allowed us to, the sort of the sports equivalent is to win the World Series 4 times in a row and then win an Olympic gold medal. That's the quality of the work that Sandy has produced and the results that it has yielded for Massachusetts. So we enlisted Sandra Stotsky. We got a guy named Jim Milgram, who's a professor of mathematics at Stanford University. He had worked on the very high quality math standards in California and advised other states like Utah that had good math standards. We got a guy named Zev Werman, who was a Silicon Valley engineer, who too had worked on the very high quality math standards, because we wanted to evaluate Common Core's drafts against high standard states like Massachusetts to see what was the academic quality. I mean, when you're talking about standards, what you're talking about is a kind of framework of what should be taught at the various grades that then is matched with a curriculum that's generated locally in classrooms and in schools to teach to those. And then they have testing that kind of locks it all together, and that evaluates how these students are doing on the tests. So what we did is we commissioned Sandy and independent researchers, the best we could find in the country, people with national reputation on academic quality, because that's really what the debate is about, is academic quality. It's not the number of states that are participating, it's not whether Jeb Bush says they're good or whether Barack Obama says they're good, or it's whether the quality of the standards, the academic quality is good. And so we started with that, and what we did is we did these crosswalk evaluations. We had Sandra and these experts in math and science move back and forth in very skillful and meticulous ways, going back and forth, looking at the standards in Massachusetts and other high standard states against Common Core to see what the rigor was like. And what they found, and they did 4 drafts. I mean, it's really a remarkable accomplishment because when they were beginning to push for this Common Core, they were rolling them out very quickly. So Sandy generated essentially 4 40 or 50 page crosswalks against Common Core in about 6 or 7 months, which is an enormous undertaking considering they had to be peer reviewed, they had to be edited, formatted. It's an enormous project. And what we found, and what they found, is that every step of the way, Common Core was of significantly lower quality than what high standard states like Massachusetts already had. Okay, so they were of lower quality. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, everybody around K-12 education for decades have known that K-12 education is under the control, the jurisdiction of states and local governments. That was very clear in the Nation at Risk report. When President Reagan's commission reported out, they diagnosed a lot of the symptoms of the academic decline. What they did not do was say that this needs to be fixed centrally by the U.S. Department of Education or the folks in Washington, D.C. They knew that it was the proper jurisdiction of the state and local government to fix these issues, and Massachusetts did that. So what we did, again, drawing on our expertise, we lined up a guy named Ken Talbert and another guy named Bob Eitel. They were the general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration. So they're essentially the 2 highest ranking lawyers in the federal government. And what we asked them to do was to evaluate what are the laws that prohibit national standards testing and curriculum. And so what they did is that they looked at it. They looked at it with great precision and lawyerly detail. And I have summaries not only of Sandy's paper, 1-page summaries of sort of the key findings from Sandy's work, but also a 1-page summary of the legal dimensions of Common Core. And what they found, in fact, is with this real precision, is what we have known, is that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from advancing national standards testing and curriculum. The first one is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson. This was really the first foray into any role in public in education for the federal government. And in that law, it's very clear that there are distinct limits, that there can be this limited federal role, but it cannot go into these areas of curriculum or what's taught specifically in the classroom. And folks in Washington, D.C. can't set up the standards, they can't work on the curriculum, they can't do the testing. The next one was the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, which was signed by President Richard Nixon. what this is a giant appropriations or funding bill for the small amount of work. I mean, again, what we're talking about in K-12 education in this country is about 10% of the budgeting for all of it is paid by the federal government. So the small amount of funding that is given from the federal government to states and local governments for education, this law too was very clear. You cannot have national standards, you can't have national curriculum, and you can't have national tests. That law went even further. It basically said if you do want to have national tests, that you need to go back to Congress and pass a bill to get approval to do this. So it went even further than the first Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And then in 1979, the legislation that established the U.S. Department of Education, so a lot of the players around public education that kind of congregate around Washington, D.C. Mary Ann mentioned the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers. These kinds of organizations, they've really always wanted two things. They wanted to have a federal Department of Education, which they got in 1979, and they wanted to have national standards curriculum and testing. Well, the U.S. Department of Education Act is explicit. We're setting up the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education and the federal government may not advance national standards testing and curriculum. So there's these three laws. Now, some of the folks that are critical of our research or our opinions on these things like to say that this is a conspiracy theory, that we don't know what we're talking about. But about a year ago, George Will, the syndicated columnist who reaches about 30 million readers, did a column, and I've included it back there, outlining exactly what I just told you about the three federal laws, and cites our research. So, there's a lot of things I think you can say about George Will, but he's a pretty mainstream syndicated columnist with enormous credibility, who agreed with us and cited our research And then the final piece of it that we were interested in, because given that Common Core will be impacting essentially 45 million school children in this country, what we decided to do is that we figured that the people that are advancing this might actually tell the people that are going to pay for it, the state and local level, what it's going to cost, but they didn't. So we said, all right, we're going to commission the best researcher we can to map out or do a cost projection of what it's going to cost states and localities to implement it. We hired a guy named Ted Barber. He works for an organization called Accountability Works. He worked in the U.S. Department of Education under the first Bush administration and the first term of the Clinton administration, so he's worked for both Republicans and Democrats. He's the kind of guy who's a budgeteer and a budget analyst for the federal government that would be as a staff member in budget negotiations when President Clinton was in office, negotiating with former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich or former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. I mean, he's a high-level D.C. Staffer. He's familiar with the federal role. He's familiar with K-12 education. He's worked on it for 25 or 30 years of his career. And what he and his researchers found is that implementing Common Core in the states and localities is going to be about $16 billion. It's $16 billion with a B. So, and again, that's funding that will come not from the federal government. They are not going to be paying for this. It's going to be paid for locally. What we also found as we mapped out for the various states, because we're primarily a Massachusetts-based research organization, we had him take a look at what it's going to cost for Massachusetts, and it's going to cost Massachusetts about $360 million. So on top of the $100 billion that Massachusetts spent over the last 20 years to take us from sort of middle of the pack to #1 in the country and internationally competitive, we're going to have to spend additional resources in the tune of $360 million, revamping all the textbooks, doing all new professional development for teachers, and then enormous technology costs, because a lot of what the national testing will look like will be driven by tests that are online, and they're all done paper and pencil now. So there'll be significant costs associated with it. I guess from my point of view, and I've been working on this now for over 2+ years, so we're very active in the months leading up to Massachusetts adopting. I guess one of the things that I'm sort of most troubled by is the really cavalier way in which unelected private organizations from Washington, D.C., the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, Achieve Inc., the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who have spent about $100 million advocating for Common Core and funding the standards and funding people to evaluate the standards that they funded, playing judge and jury in their own case. There's been an astonishing lack of transparency here. These are private organizations. If you want to do a Freedom of Information Act search to find out, what were the decision-making processes for developing the standards, you can't get that information because it's developed outside of the public trust and by people who are not accountable to the public. But these are organizations. Bill Bennett was the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. He was a very controversial, provocative guy. These are the trade organizations that back in the 80s Bill Bennett called the blob, the education blob. These are the people that he thought were responsible for creating a lot of the problems that had been outlined in A Nation at Risk. They were not people with great records of improving student achievement anywhere. And really, frankly, in the last 20 or 25 years, if you look at the work of Achieve Inc. or the Fordham Institute or this Governors Association or the Council of Chief State School Officers, the players that have kind of DC players that are around us, you can't find one state where they've actually improved student achievement anywhere. And in point of fact, they often decry the poor quality of standards that you find across the country. But a lot of these folks have worked in states. And the poor quality standards are the ones that they have developed over the last 20 years. So, not only have they brushed aside the proven high quality standards that we had here in Massachusetts, which we have a record of, leading to dramatic gains in student achievement, but they've also, they themselves don't have a record. These are not folks that you would really want to entrust the future of your children's academic career on, because they can't prove that their work has contributed to very much of anything, frankly. So that gives you, frankly, a lot of information. And Sandy will go into a lot more detail about the specifics of the standards themselves and why Massachusetts standards in a qualitative sense were better than Common Core, and what this is going to mean in both English and in math. But I think the thing that we have been struck by, and we've been, again, working on this for several years, and with really every passing week, we are getting so many emails, inquiries, and requests across the country, because really at this point, about 15 or 20 states are actively pushing against it. There's a handful of states from the beginning, Texas is one of them, and Virginia and Nebraska or others, that said, we're not doing this. We don't want the strings attached. We know our responsibilities. K-12 education is our job. It's not the job of the federal government. And some of these states, like Texas, have really experienced a lot of wrath from the U.S. Department of Education, where they start piling on lots of auditors and lots of threats and to withhold their money. And the fact is that through this Race to the Top, which is a federal grant that the Obama administration used to really herd states into it, and by funding these national testing consortia, they basically have funded the federal government has funded two national testing consortia. They're really using all of the bureaucratic mechanisms and levers at their disposal to try to herd states into it. And I think what's sort of fascinating about it is that